welcome to the final reading for the spring Holloway Poetry Series. Tonight we're very happy to have with us Cecily Nicholson from Vancouver, with a host of other Vancouver writers. Cecily will be introduced by Angus Reid, and reading first will be Laura Ritland, who will be introduced by Noor Asif. And this is the final reading. The spring schedule has not yet been set, so watch your emails, for that. And welcome and thank you all for coming out this evening. Happy to see so many of you. I will turn this over to Noor Asif, who will introduce Laura Ritland. Noor Asif.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. I have the pleasure today to introduce the first poet of the night, Laura Ritland. Laura Ritland is a poet, a teacher, and a scholar from Vancouver, British Columbia. She is the author of a poetry collection titled East and West, published with Vehicle Press, and a chapbook titled Marine Science, published with Toronto's and Strother Press. Her work has been shortlisted for the League of Canadian Poets Pat Lowther Memorial Award. It has won the Malahat Far Horizons Poetry Award and also been featured and anthologized in publications across Canada, including The Walrus, In Fine Form, edited by Kate Braid and Sandy Shreve, Canadian Notes Inquiries, The Fiddlehead, The Malahat Review, and Arc Poetry. Her most recent work is published or forthcoming in Maisonneuve and 14 Hills. At UC Berkeley, where she is a PhD candidate in the Department of English, she has served twice as a fellow with the Bay Area's New Literary Project and is a current fellow and mentor for undergraduates through the Berkeley Connect program. Her doctoral research focuses on the intertwined histories of literary education and literary criticism across British and British Imperial Anglophone contexts, with particular interest in the issues of democracy, anti-colonialism, and the social function of the intellectual. I met Laura last year during my first semester of my first year as a graduate student in the Department of English. And something that I've particularly enjoyed about our friendship is our long conversations, which ultimately coalesce into shared meditations on writing. I always ask Laura, how do you find the time to write poetry? How do you switch between the demands of academic writing and the fundamentally different mental environment of poetry? How do you grapple with the anxieties and pains that have affected all of us throughout the pandemic? And how do you create out of that? Throughout our conversations, Laura's thoughts about writing practices have always been so thoughtful, so rooted in experience, and attentive to one's bodily, mental, and emotional limitations. During times when I haven't been able to get myself to write fiction, talking to Laura has always comforted me and helped me believe that one will always return to write if one treats oneself with both care and discipline. And reading is one of the best ways to feel inspired enough to write again, which is something that Laura and I have talked about a lot over the past year or so. And I felt particularly inspired by reading her poetry, specifically her poems from East and West. This collection, divided into 4 sections that map onto the cardinal directions, is at once both personal and theoretical. Its poems traverse the various landscapes of the family, of origins, of school, of empire, of the guilt one feels for seizing or failing to seize opportunity at the expense of all of the things one's ancestors may have lost along the way for them. It explores the queasiness of girlhood, the awkwardness of love, the struggle to write. But above all, to me at least, these poems, despite their meditations on sudden transformation, heartbreak, painful nostalgia, imperfection, loss, they're shot through with a voice that's both defiant and vulnerable. This voice ties together the poems, otherwise separated by east, west, north, south, and propels them forth in one direction, even if that voice doesn't quite know what that destination might be, or if there even is one at all. And this is all to say that I deeply admire Laura and her work, and I'm so excited to hear what she's going to read for us tonight. So please join me in welcoming Laura.
Thank you, Nora. That was an incredible introduction, and I'm super honored by your words. Nora is an incredible fiction writer, and you should all go look up her work and read it. I'm similarly a benefactor of our conversation, so thank you. I'm really pleased to be reading alongside Cecily Nicholson tonight and to be sort of priming the stage for her. I'm a big fan of her work and jumped at the opportunity to read alongside her. So I thought I would start by reading a few poems from my book that just were poems that came to mind as I was listening to her talk yesterday and thinking about Vancouver, which is the city that we both share. And I want to start with a poem, given that it's raining. It's a poem about rain. It's a poem called Song. It rained last night. Great puddles made liquid twins of the world in the roadways and sidewalks, opening seam after seam of silver reflection. So this is how sorrow looks this morning, I think, on my way to be somewhere else. The sky whisked, pale, recovering brightness, a shoal of mirrors glancing back with portraits and water. All night the rain drummed its stones on my roof, drummed itself I, into one measureless roar. This is all I thought. This is called living with oneself. Each question was filled with the same answer. But today insists on otherwise, the manyness and difference of rainfall, soil, streetlight, car. This traffic will take me to wherever I need to go, and in time. Today I am drawn to the glass replies of shop fronts, the bright skins of filled drains, curbside pools. I travel in bus windows, sunlit and bodied, framed with strangers who wait, like me, to arrive. The air is full of exchanges, quiet nods, turnings, the multiple gleam of wet leaves on branches, eyes. Sorrow flicks away from us and drops into new centers. Water lightens, trembles, and we continue to the city under canopies of connected wire and sky. So one thing I was really struck about in Cecily's talk is thinking about ecology and the connectedness of nature and life. And I don't have any poems about farming or gardening, which is something I also love and adore doing too. But I do have a poem about intertidal zones and thinking about ecological connectedness, which is, I think, something I was sort of thinking about as you were giving your speech, your talk yesterday, Cecily. So this poem is called Water Movement, and it sort of dwells on the intertidal zone as a place of ecological connectedness. And it's from I open with an epigraph from this textbook about Pacific seashores, and the epigraph reads, "The simplest thing that can be said about tides is that they are complicated." So here's the poem. Moon stings in an anemone's arms. Gravity swoons in the sea spray. In these lands, shellfish civilize not by law, but pronged currents, helmets for homes, a rack of shields shearing the surf's assailment. Temperature, wind, moisture, even the sun's mass moves the fronds of the sea palm remotely. Crabs devise entries in thorny rotundas of barnacles. Sea stars wander in and out of orbits, constellate strength. Deeper in the lower spectrum, the phlegmatic tones of kelp roil with surfgrass and sea tangle. Purple laver signals from shallow verges of the rock faces consume photons and chemical humors. Sunburned, cooled, these flora and fauna make their living in the swoop of equinox and apogee. Oyster heads rattle to the song of the planets. So those are poems from the book that Noor talked about, East and West. And since then, I've been trying to work on a couple new things. And I want to read just two new poems that I've been working on. The first one is called It Matters Not, and it is an amalgamation of my experience living in the US over the past few years during the various political turmoils that the US, but also the world has been going through, and also my experiences during the pandemic also, and thinking about the role of poetry in all of these things going on. So the poem's called It Matters Not, and it opens with a quotation from W.H. Auden's poem, Like a Vocation. And the quotation epigraph reads, alone among the noise and policies of summer, this weeping climbs towards your life like a vocation. So the poem is called It Matters Not. To when we settled on public benches under our hats of sun, 2 at a time, 3, when to talk of beauty was the frisbee flung between the shoots of young hands or the glint of daffodils gifted from neighbor to table. What are you now? What becomes us as we sleep deeper into the growing silence, the streets empty of witness to the passing 2-day shipping truck and bus vacant as dry grass in a rainless summer? What causes solicit you to the closed burrito shop, the blind down schools, bars of belly up chairs, those canyons of silent warehouses where we once stalked our better selves? Do you really think yourself safe from the violence of others' interiors? Still, there is the matter of your country. And with embarrassing frankness, as with the nudity of a newborn child, you are tasked to speak of what you know. Those towns of lesser than, cities of more, state fires, a seasonal hate that arrives as predictably as the inland heat spreads its arches over the highway encampments, the sick and dying, the hills and watered estates where someone goes on living a life that is, if not good, not painful. What will you tell them? What could you possibly say to anyone? Do they think that you, just by standing there, wielding equipment roughly equivalent to a bent horsebrush and a stepladder, could make any effect on the world? Can you say you have kicked in any windows lately? Or, for that matter, out? After all, you already know that you will not be saved by an absence of interests. Death also strikes you now familiar, the long indrawn breath that leaves behind it a brushed leaf, a touch whose memory is consolation. And someone keeps dialing you with furious intent. Someone is coming down the walkway toward you, their stride convicted of serious meaning. So the last poem I want to read tonight is an excerpt from a long poem that I'm working on called Constitution. And the form of the poem is based on the Constitution Act of 1867. So the British North America Act that was the sort of constitutional act that made Canada into a nation, basically, and divided up the various powers of the federal and provincial government. And I'm interested in using this legal form basically to inhabit it, but also kind of explode it from the inside out, and thinking about the ways that this form has shaped and molded our relationship to the land, to Indigenous peoples, to others, to immigrants. And I'm sort of trying to use this form to talk about also an autobiographical story about myself growing up in Canada too. So it's a new thing that I'm working on. And one of the things to know about the poem is that I use the phrase whereas, because this is a phrase that is used in the Constitution to introduce this a few statements of facts. But it's also, I use it as a conjunction. So in the sense of comparison too. So I'm sort of playing with legal language here and also trying to play around with the way that can be used as a conjunction. So it probably makes more sense if I just read the poem, and I'm just going to read 3 sections of it. I'm hoping to have 11 parts eventually, but I'm just going to read the first 3. So it's called Constitution. Whereas I finally become a woman, the virtues of a lawful, ordinary life, whereas the shape of which we sit around, we call a table. Whereas a girl, her damp proclivity to speaking in a tone like water, if just water and a tone. If I was good at the table, if I kissed you in a feminine way, my mouth a candid fact submitted to the world. Whereas I was once a lean and serious artist making pots of coiled clay in grade 10. She of furrowed brow, hair falling over her face onto the canvas table without speaking to anyone. Whereas the balloon makers in the city park across the bay, which she admired, sleeving their voices into colored animals. The gym teacher's evaluation of me at age 14, pretending to play capture the flag under red cedars. The term I am looking for is Canada, the swish of big branches at night, where a tree is a bayonet, as a tree is a house, or maybe a girl's way of hiding her mouth when she speaks so she might be liked. Supposing we understand me as good, that we moved the table into a house and the house was painted white. Inside, we decided to call a poem a nation, and we peopled it with poets and artists. We decided I liked water and a tone. You can sit here, you see, if you stay quiet. The refinement of your lineation. Whereas I abandoned it, buried it, like Keats' piano in Roman streets to rid the public of infection. I dropped the flag into the hands of my enemies. I took it to the back and broke it, its splinters making a shaky new country on the grass. Whereas I, a citizen, whereas the beauty of sonnets, their faces smooth and free of zits. Whereas she, a fleshy vessel, molded under the will to be an artist, wearing the secondhand black dress to the school dance out of pride. Supposing to be this way is all you can say. That you, an infected instrument, sing like this, regardless of your composition, regardless of your willingness to be other than what you are. How rational and pure you seem, standing next to your wide sculpture of a tree and frowning up at the gallery skylights. Well done. If only sometimes you kissed like a man and had a better attitude to team sports. 2. If the right to fail was in your power to determine, if you, hailing from a race of poetry, sat at a table categorically awake at a lesson on geography, if to be a child meant curling into tight spaces, the precious zero of you cradled to your navel where no one could touch, you tried to speak like the silk of creek water, your voice mapping the Gulf Islands. If this, if that, if the rounded thighs of clouds moved over the Pacific, if they rained sometimes with the sound of small river stones falling, and not English rain rimming the heads of daffodils in English gardens. Whereas the false cedars whose marrow lay on the ground in jagged red strips, whereas salal, whereas hemlock, whereas the raven and the muskrat. Supposing I succumbed to the invasion, if I took apart the table and made it into a piano and the piano sang songs that made the people weep, whereas the nightingale in a famous poem scaling its castle of twilit branches, whereas the crows cracking mussels in the inlet, their caws coughed from a gut crook. I dug my fingers into the silt and felt my body fade against the beach. A sloppy, half-assed pioneer on a sandbar the size of a continent. Your poetry made you civil. You were brought up by Englishmen who were afraid of dying. If I let my knees, my waist, my neck be subtracted by the cold Pacific, then what you would do would be speech. Okay, so last section that I'll read. But supposing I confess to you, I have become a woman and a citizen, a texture like park grass that holds us beside each other. And supposing it weren't treason not to be ourselves in public, we moved the table into the street and served drinks to the pedestrians. We offered fruit to the neighbors without touching, handed out sections of a broken instrument, knobs, splinters, slices of ivory. If by giving it away, we made a concert, abandoned chords left out to sea, returning on the tides of our children's lips. If by leaving our belongings on the streets. If by hanging my female clothes to dry, flying free as wet flags from a balcony. Supposing then I was the feeling of spiny fins of grass under your palms. If I was shiny or smooth, mottled or airy, sticky as an anklet of seaweed, a house to shelter our maps from water, the soldered base of a broken vessel. Supposing we suspended the procedure, that I was done with legislating the vegetation and could rest in the arms of my shadow. You for whom history crumples in sandflakes from a fist to be recomposed into castles. A wink in earth time, a terror of western uncanny light. Whereas you slipped into the house one night through an open window and let in the birds, the rats, the mice. Thank you.
Laura, thank you very much for that, and thank you, Noor. Angus.
Hello. To say this is a little funny, it's a lineup of 3 Vancouverites in a row, but I don't know if that was planned fully. I'll just jump in, but I think maybe it would be nice to imagine that we're in the Mod 5 room after the rain and that we can smell the eucalyptus grove, because it's quite beautiful here right now. But my immediate instinct before beginning any sort of introduction was to provide a territorial acknowledgement. Yet this instinct was followed by a sort of vertigo. Institutionally, we sit on Ohlone land, but as we zoom, we're distributed across the various indigenous nations of Turtle Island. The poet in question, Cecily Nicholson, joins us from the unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, the Squamish, Stolo, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam nations. As a reader, my geographical reception of Nicholson's work has also been split. I have read her work in the Bay as a reluctant Canadian and in Vancouver as a somewhat embittered Berkeley student. And to quote a famous Bay Area poet, I have often felt as if there were no there, or perhaps no here. Yet as Nicholson's work reminds us, no moment of deictic uncertainty can alter our condition, to borrow a phrase used in From the Poplars, as subjects of capture. Institutional life, for better or worse, is just often just that, one form enclosing, subsuming, or capturing another. Put in other words, the work of acknowledgement often seems to shade into the work of disavowal. To understand this is in part to understand that at the present, quote, we are still living with the effects of a moment in which the notions of emancipation that had become fully articulate by the late 1960s and early 1970s would finally and publicly lose the sympathetic ear of state and economic power. This is artist and writer Stan Douglas speaking in the early 1990s. Yet 20 years later, his warning still stands. For Douglas, to continue, the return of this particular repressed, and he's speaking of the radicalism of the 60s and 70s, had in many ways reduced countercultural notions of alterity to mere properties of form. But Douglas's warning points to is not just a historical moment, but a movement in thought and action, a movement from sites of contestation, to reference yesterday's mixed blood talk, to the dampening and co-optation of political contestation by properties of form. Yet as if in response to Stan Douglas, Cecily Nicholson's poetry pushes against any such co-optation. Her 3 books, Triage, From the Poplars, and Wayside Sang, cross-reference and reanimate sites of contestation, moving from company towns to timber mills, from Vancouver to Detroit. Through such movement they are, to cite Nicholson once again, always proposing connections. It is with this line that I want to end and to let Cecily begin, if only to suggest that her work poses connection against capture. As Indigenous land defenders fight state violence from Unistoten to Fairy Creek, 2 sites of contemporary contestation and struggle, Nicholson's poetics enact an acknowledgement not as stilled form, but as movement in search of an outside. Thank you, Cecily, and welcome.
Thank you, Angus.
Thank you, Angus. I wasn't sure where you were going with that, so I appreciate the effort and the time to put that thought together. Laura, thank you. That was a great reading, and it's so such fine choices in your language. You're moving through so many scales all at once there, and it's just a very fine eye for detail. So I really, really appreciated listening, and you more than warmed the screen, as it were. Absolutely. So I look forward to connecting again to both of you. My thanks once again to Cecil for the invitation, for UC Berkeley English for hosting me, Jess for holding down the admin, and anybody else who's contributing to work to today's event. I really appreciate the time. And then all y'all rolling up to hear some poetry. So right on, we need you. We don't exist without the readers and the listeners and our fellow poets. So yeah, I'm glad to be here. Just to say a bit further, while I am in an area of Salish people, I'm in more specifically in Hittite territory. So this is a band that is very, very small and fought very hard to be recognized as a official nation onto the Canadian state, and is still contesting. This is the three sort of parcels of area of so-called New Westminster. And From the Poplars is a book that sort of deals a lot with that. So I won't say too much more, but also to acknowledge the traditional waterways of the Musqueam and the Kwantlen and Katzie peoples that have centered for millennia around this river here, known as the Stalo. So I am going to read from 3 suites of poems tonight, and they connect thematically and throughout, I think, pretty obvious ways. For those of you who came out to the talk yesterday, thank you. I'm in some ways going to pick up pretty much from where I left off, and I'm also going to use a little bit of images, I'm going to use some images to start out, just to kind of shift attention away from my office space. And yeah, so enough said, I hope. Let me share some screens, see how that goes. Great, can you see an image? Hard to describe. Some beats, a farm. Somatically, this body remembers farm as a rurally entrenched kid, as I lived, once cultivated and punctuated by the occasional bush and ditches that weren't much at all, like these rolling hills songed in mission bells in reach of cemetery lawns across the road away. That feel now familiar. Playground fields, former ward youth intermittently involved. Estate care. I cared less. I cared more. And for more. And about and around me. My paper son observes we cannot reckon with how Black people are often confronted by the impossibility of settlement because anti-Blackness positions Black people as out of place on land. Where have I been a settler? Where I am, returning to efforts of cultivation. I think on Vicky Mochama's discussion on mutual aid, her reminder that these practices are not new, but rather longstanding traditions instilled in Black community and other community and experience. And Paul Taylor's organizing, I'm thinking of on terms of food security, problems that cannot be answered with casseroles and cooperatives given the service of labors. Herein, my reallocated labor. Passages via free gardens, as fish pepper plants made way to Chesapeake table settings. Horace Pippin, the painter, gave seeds to H. Ralph Weaver, a bookkeeper. Simmering the young pale peppers in visible heat, coveted cream sauce for fish, hence the name, the first time, shimmery and feminine. Heat is a subjective test. One for sensitive. One is prickly, once flaring at the hip. All in all, a farm is a good teacher. Farming out from under the heat, abiding in trenches, Once honeybees, pigs outside pens, vegetables fenced in loam turned casings, scrape of sprays, Scovilles sear the eyes, law enforcement degrades in the indecent haste of colony. Light render and pollination, I sleep not enough for too long, dreaming, half woke. An array maturing green to red, the hottest, though even orange streaked bloody midsection tangles at the measure, the presence of twilight, fertility and life I could never hold in me, springs from thumbs, a perfectly verdant ancestry. Include the number of hours working for wages, working overtime, alone or in partnerships, working directly towards the operation of a farm, with or without formal pay arrangements, for example, assisting in seeding or doing accounts. Include indentured geopolitics, include incarcerated labors, to hold a blistering California reaper in repose. It's the drive, it's the roads getting smaller and smaller, and murmurs of blackbirds or two eagles on a single branch. Roadside purchases, pick your own pacing, another year, counting beans, those seedlings, 6 now 8 feet, a witness to irrigation. Heirloom systems of runners climb rows, string poles and espalier, scaffold, American fork and hoe, trenching shovel, black wheelbarrow temper. Hauling wood chips is nice, and after, as if we will last these latest next crises, we, resplendent and sympathetic, confident lungs finally wail, the grief pulse a leaf of sky green, never to be seen. It moves somehow. Is it the sky or is it the planet? Sown, berm, a surge, the dirt is land, is soil, is a great teacher. And the fray that faces a surface deep practice in harrowing matters. A voice that will clamor. These are drafts of poetry. Correspondents have included a few examples for tonight. These extend from a so-called prison farm run by former inmates to its missing laborers. Carceral architecture precludes human distancing. To stem outbreaks of COVID-19, prisoners have been held in solitary conditions, refused visits and access to elders, chaplaincy, and necessary social programs, especially programs that are non-secular and not offered by the institution. Waivers, and I'm speaking to a Canadian context, waivers promised for the telephone system are not fully realized. Alterable factors and responsibilities for diminished mental health and deaths in custody are abundant. From cultivated and ponded poetics, 4 clefs incline in mutual will-o'-the-wisp and noise tremors lifting 19-inch TVs and manual typewriters, soil and irrigation, the infrastructure rose. Dear, base wraps around. We've not met. Folks been gathering this pen pack. May this, what electronic equipment would you like? See personal effects list. Only if available. No Wi-Fi or Bluetooth items. In a list, I'd wish you to it. Gone solitary moments undesired. Could this electronic 19-inch TV, 720p HD LED TV with the highest temporal resolution possible, with some feet of coaxial cable to situate it anywhere that the room allows, may improve, be approved to connect to outside, to play Nintendo, and up to 10 games. May you get to listen to a stereo, to a Discman, a CD player with headphones. For all, a 4-outlet power bar, PlayStation 1 with up to 10 games, for the people. For the people need the air to move with one 5.5-inch plastic fan, rechargeable batteries and a battery charger for the people. A reading lamp with 2 extra light bulbs, please, said the note, and I read this and I cried. Reading lamp light, the typewriter is manual and electric. What will it say? An alarm clock, newest of new items. May you have some new things. Under one or more of the following personal identifiers: a serial number, an inmate's name, an engraved locator number, a barcode. Dear. Counter. Transpose. Dear. In these few quiet aches in the key bone of the shoulder girdled, serving to link the scapula and the sternum. On the same stave transposed collarbone as the heirloom tomatoes gone wild, the leaders strung up, new eaters, new leaders woven in, leaders taking away from the plant, lopped off. In the big beef corner of the market, tomatoes pulling 10 feet topple the structures. And yeah, I'm bent at the hips, the slipping back, the rural youth and skillless, joyless grinds. I remember, but this is my reallocated labor, my mutual aid, my gratitude given the respite, the fresh takes on abolition, the best insights into agricultural complexes, my gratitude, rested, reading, bathing, swimming, running, well earned. Dear, fell into the mud as slipping the clay bed makes its rise a yellow along the row and mire in the greenhouse, muck in the house with no dog, the straw gets taken up, the new plants are growing all the time. The ginger can't seem to grow without dancing. After the carrots all hopped up with limbs line the coop now and are in the pickle jars, the rare one, straight, is found and pulled, the miracle of nitrogen, the light in here. I should stay in a greenhouse all the time, the light. It's that third leg on the circuit you had to run early, safe quartering all afternoon in order to miss a catch of storm. Like that lettuce and the beets that run. It's that kind of light in here. Here to you. From here to you. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, but before I do, I just wanted to share this one small image from my youth. I unfortunately don't have a lot of photographs. I don't really have any from less than 2 years, but I have very few in my childhood, but I kind of cherish this one. Just happens to be a corner, believe it or not, it's a super wide angle, but the stop sign should give it away. But this is the corner where I caught the bus to school. And I could see it, we could see it coming for miles. This is actually about half a mile we could see. And across the way was a big tree, and that's where we huddled behind on the colder days. But we walked about a quarter of a mile in the snow with no shoes, just kidding. But no, we did walk a quarter of the mile, and this is where I caught the bus. So I don't know, just thought you might like to see. So yeah, this next section of the poems is just grounding a little bit deeper in that rural, remote youth. Brought to labor. Well, it was barely spring. The winter had lingered the year we needed to dig a new well. I knew enough of septic tanks and cisterns, the metal alloys comprising pipes and insulation of prayer that kept things from bursting on the coldest snow-belted nights, many of us awake, but for different reasons, hearing the creaks, to be wary. Early lessons in infrastructure, I would absolve myself of worry in later and faraway future as a renter in a cloud, tethered to the grids of city systems, miles up from the rain barrels. To divine. A well could use a diviner. In advance, this thing to do and some place to start, when really we had no idea. The pond could not indicate potable. The fallow soil it spreaded rocks and hay at least was out of the way, and that happened to be where the diviner encouraged the backhoe to dig. Each foot cost money. Adults went to work and the children went to school a whole day and returned to no water still. Pinched faces at the window discuss what happens if they have to stop. Maybe there is insufficient water on a property and more debt. In the rock piles, we imagine stories in and of the dirt as it descended, which bones and artifacts became present. The butterfly stone fossils, the arrowheads would become possessions. Which culture were we supposed to make fun of ourselves? The dirty fingers, brown and browner, overturning new rocks in the rock pile, hopeful, hunting in rock piles. The light stretched long enough to risk our small feet catching a crag. So we formed adjacent rock beds and set ourselves in to watch the sun down over a field of soy or corn rows. The corn row paths back to scrub brush, furrowed till rust and the tassels told us it was combine season. Rotating blades I could not hear or see. The sky cast bush shadows an acre off against a thin band of horizon glowing as the stars rose. After winter, those nights paved roads whitened completely as flakes piled up past cladding and through ditches, the snow fence bending one ruddy, weak slat after another against the draft whose very purpose was to penetrate. These fences figure again and again, but for now the iron rods and their constant burrow of rust are the stalwart chroniclers of weather. It had been a winter such as this that pushed deeply into spring, that flattened the longing buds into slow bursts of fragrance. In relief, the time between bird calls lengthened more than had been usual. Relief when finally the smell of mud struck our consciousness like lilacs, but only sweeter, as the heat of the sun registered warmth on skin and trickles of water coursed the driveway rutting down the hill into the ditch. The water table began to rise. And in the rise of pond, after the migration stop was drained and we fought and lost again to the chemical pond lined with black tarp, we turned to the front yard swamp. To bend to pond the green life that fought to hold the other, to an emulsion state, neither water nor mud, somewhat tadpoles, where catching frogs was possible. And even still today, one can realize the terror in another creature being held. Holding up a frog by its two back legs, an instant over so fast, few will witness it, like the ruddy farm boy who died before my age now, having drunk to expansion and heartened out winter after hard winter, broke into laughter. We could not hear it, but it was nice to imagine something genuine. And it was the frogs, not us, who made it clowning, this holding a frog by its two back legs dance. Festina lente, make haste, but slowly. Stump of stumps. Stump, of course, used to be a tree, remembered best as a stage or a seat we sat upon at the end of the driveway, watching a perfectly red sunset. We knew about sailors, and we knew we had relations on islands. We had excursions, serving sailboats on Great Lakes. We took commands out of the thin mouth of uncles and strangers. We ran to the prow, and we ran to the stern, and we were not sickened. We learned how to float in fresh water. We were able to swim. Our bellies buoyed us. Our breath, brethren, forms a deep amplification. Bioluminescent, My bioluminescence and births edge the farm. From a dimension deep, music and poetry edged a farm. In serenade, when Stump was still a tree, my Italian suitor sat and strummed his guitar underneath, having walked a country block and a half from his host family's home to sit there quietly making songs in Spanish, the language of love, he explained to me, is a good place to rest. Well, they, someone or other, called him, as only a queer query made sense to my 15 years of ugly. Only a queer Afrik could make such music. The tree was an early stage. I wish I knew more about it. I thought a maple. I thought a hardwood grade and all the gray eyes since. These efforts that took a stand, the many last stands of trees and ditches along a field and cultivated tracks. Vidi nihil permanere sub sol. I have seen nothing under the sun endure. The verb to hit the road. Memoirs are always too soon, so I guess that means never. These nails that stuck out of a broom over the head that punctured the scalp. The organized running, learning to run. These gravel road needs sets of scars. Trying hand signals that we were taught in gym class, like the tractor was watching to see which direction I would turn a quarter mile back. Still twice as fast on my BMX from the National Tire Company. I had saved and saved, first for my clock radio that raced me for my early short bus, and babysitting work once I got to it. The red was wheels and a frame and spokes and a seat even. To be like the sister who got a bike and essentially rode it immediately, skipping past training wheels. Amongst the boys, it remains legendary. My labors, bred to the business of farm, cracked along a nose. I trust nose scars. I trust we have something in common, even if it was from years of playing hockey, backhand, bat-borne beam, that chainsaw or tire shrapnel or a breakout of obscene proportion. Chances are we had something in common between us. Not this iron rod aforementioned. It always purposed itself a fence pole, always prodded up from the banks of winter, and it had no intent. Above all, I was triumphant that day. I was so bad off I got taken to the hospital. The golf ball pushed my skin permanently into a crease that matches my frown now, and I think it works. And that doctor, so sweet, leaning in, sort of talking to me, changed something. I just wanted to say one last image. I love this one. Wells, Captain Wells, liberation to lifers, burst of cells, bust of lings, tamp the surface, the tender watery gnarls, irrigation systems find roots as they find us with our fistfuls of vegetables, shapes caked in dirt, for a tired body can sleep. My nail grit fingertip relief against tomato blood lost blooms, blooms for days. The endorphins are a cloudy crimson, a 3-pepper hot sauce and a citrus brine. In the cupboard, smoked peppers from last fall infused with a snip of lilac on the counter. My home and its kitchen are close now. It's almost summer. Our great hearts I open onto every day we open. I think I'll leave it there.